We're very pleased to be here today to present the state of play of CO2 storage in Europe. It's a CO2GeoNet report that is prepared as an update to the previous version. In 2013, we prepared the first state of play on CO2 geological storage in 28 European countries. And since then, the CCS landscape has changed. So we see the role for CO2 capture and storage within the portfolio of available emission reduction options is currently under discussion in many European countries. We see positive policy developments at national, international and EU levels. And we see new initiatives helping drive CCS forwards, such as projects of common interest or the Innovation Fund. So we think there's some really interesting developments happening at the moment. And we also see something new for me. I've been working in CO2 storage for 20 years, and we see the emergence of CO2 transport and storage services. So this for me is very exciting because it's something new that hasn't happened before, and I'm really pleased to see this. So what we wanted to do today is to take this opportunity to have the authors of each of the chapters present to you a consolidated view of CO2 storage aspects. So there's quite a lot covered in the report. It covers the state of play as of the 30th of June 2021. There are one or two updates that crept in because there were some things that happened after the report had been finalised that were just a bit too exciting to miss out. But we wanted to make sure that we had a consolidated point, and this was at the 30th of June 2021. Now, obviously, we are Co2GeoNet, so this is very focused on CO2 storage, but we have included information on capture, transport, utilisation and storage where appropriate. And what we wanted to do was consider what had changed. So this could be read in conjunction with the previous report. So you can see the growth of CCS in Europe. You can see that it had a bit of a rocky period for some years due to various external factors, but that CCS again seems to be on the rise. And that was one of the reasons that we were so interested to look now at what the state of play was in CCS in Europe. So this report is based on questionnaires answered by national experts in country. So they looked at options for and potential and capacity within each country. They considered the national climate protection policies, legislation and regulations relevant for CO2 geological storage. And then they looked at where there was actual practical demonstrations for CO2 capture, injection and storage. And of course, research activities, because CO2GeoNet covers the full chain, starting from very low technology readiness levels all the way through to implementation of CCS. So we're very interested in research and what's coming next and how various aspects of CO2 storage are being refined. And then we considered looking at national actors, people driving CCS forward, public awareness and engagement. So having a bit of a wider look, not just at the geology, but what's the wider landscape within the country. So we had excellent country participation, and I wanted to thank everybody who took the time to provide information, data, and to answer all of the questions that we had when we were writing and editing the report. So we had huge participation and many people contributed to this, and we're very fortunate to have so much information provided. Within the report itself, the main body of the report is a summary, but you can see individual country questionnaires provided in the report annex. So if you really want to know exactly what's happening in a particular country, you can look for this. So it's fantastic. We have 32 European countries covered, many of which were covered by CO2GeoNet member countries, but we also reached out to our CO2 storage friends outside of CO2GeoNet, and they were also very willing to contribute to this report. And I'd like to thank everybody. And I'd particularly like to thank the drafting team. So I know you can't read all these names, but they will be there for when the slides are posted on the website. And I would just like to thank everybody. And of course, a special thanks goes to Heike, who has done a huge amount of effort and a huge amount of patience to get this report consolidated. So thank you very much, Heike. And that was it from me. And without holding up the exciting technical information that you've actually come here to see, I will now hand over to the next speaker. So Heike, the floor is yours to give the overview and key messages from the report. So Heike will present a short summary just to whet your appetite, and detail will be provided further on in the webinar. Heike, over to you.
Okay, thank you. So just to check, can you see my slide?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So also very warm welcome from my side to everybody. On behalf of the drafting team, I would like to present you an overview of the main findings from our state of play assessment, as Carrie just said. So what are the key findings of our assessment? Well, overall, we see that CCS is moving forward in Europe. We can see a clear progress in bringing CCS back onto national agendas for climate protection. This can be related to various factors, one of them being the continuous support of CCS by EC policies and measures. Also, the need to set up national climate protection strategies stimulated discussions in various countries on the potential role of CCS. In some countries, the option to achieve negative emissions by combining CO2 storage with direct air capture or biomass combustion increased the awareness of CCS as a whole. We see a strong movement in Europe from CCS or CO2 storage research to implementation. Many large-scale projects are now in advanced planning and implementation stages. However, still the Norwegian large-scale projects at Sleipner and Snøhvit and the Icelandic pilots for in situ mineral storage are the only storage sites in operation in Europe. Regarding legislation, there has been progress in transposing the EU Ccs Directive and implementing respective national legislations. And it is very important to mention CO2 export for offshore storage is now possible among the London Protocol parties. Also, advancements were reported in national storage capacity assessments, with recent updates being undertaken in most of the or in many of the countries assessed. Last but not least, large diversification of concepts for CO2 sources and sinks took place in the last years. Concepts now include at the source side capture from different energy plants, from waste incinerators, from various industrial facilities, including, for example, production of blue hydrogen, and directly from the air. On the sink side, geological as well as in situ mineral storage is now being considered, but also the use and storage of CO2 in enhanced hydrocarbon recovery projects or different ways of utilizing CO2. This diversification will hopefully help to implement this overall family of technologies. To give you some more insights on the recent climate protection policies and strategies. Since 2013, many important policy developments have been made at international and EU levels, and various measures to support and implement those have been set up. As a consequence, many European countries had to adopt new national policies and measures to address the set up 2030 and 2050 climate objectives. For example, all EU member states had to prepare and submit a national energy and climate plan, NECP, for their 2030 climate objectives. CCS is actually mentioned in most of these NECP. However, foreseen activities relating to CCS differ significantly. They range from solely considering CCS in future energy scenarios, support for research activities, national capacity assessments, and feasibility studies, to implementation of specific large-scale CCS projects. Some countries only consider parts of the CCS chain in their strategies. Some favor CO2 capture and use over CCS. Many countries also express in their strategies the aim to establish regional bio or multilateral cooperations in Europe for CCS projects. So overall, a wide variation in goals and envisaged pathways for CO2 emission reduction and in the foreseen role of CCS is evident. More detailed information will be presented by Alexandra later on today. Regarding legislation, we can first of all state that all EU member states transposed the EU CCS Directive, and also UK, Norway and Iceland did so. In consequence, as of June 2021, CO2 storage was permitted in 19 out of the 32 assessed countries, and it was prohibited in 9 countries, or not possible. In 4 countries, there is no national legislation dedicated to CO2 storage available, so that CO2 storage is neither permitted nor prohibited there. In some countries in which CO2 storage is permitted, there are regional exclusions or specific limitations. In the Icelandic transposition, adaptations to mineral storage and basalts have been implemented. In comparison to the situation in 2012, there are some changes, but no really clear trends. What we also found very interesting is that the land and subsurface ownership differs in the assessed European countries, which in some cases gives rise to specific challenges, as I will explain you later today in my presentation on the legislation aspects. Due to the limited number of storage projects in operation or in advanced implementation stages in Europe, there's also very limited experience with the licensing procedures for CO2 storage, both on the operator side and with the regulatory bodies. So some knowledge and experience sharing among those could be useful. In the assessed 32 countries, there are various national advocates for CCS who try to drive this technology forward and its implementation. These include national CO2 clubs and networks, national scientific or engineering academies, think tanks or governmental fora, individual institutions or industry representatives, and national representatives of regional networks. Who is actually active varies from country to country. Despite their efforts and efforts from different research projects on public engagement, the awareness of CCS within the general republic is still low to very low in most countries. It is somewhat higher among political and industrial stakeholders. Please note that these statements are in most cases based on the reported perception of the individual contributor to this report from each country, and these are not based on any social scientific survey, so they should be treated with some care. In many countries, attention by media increased during the recent negotiations on the national climate protection strategies. In the general public, CCS is often still perceived as a risky technology. The perception was reported to be somewhat more positive in some countries for capture on CO2 sources other than fossil-fueled power plants. In particular, CCS concepts allowing for negative emissions lead to a higher acceptance also of CO2 storage in some countries. And offshore storage has in many countries a higher acceptance than onshore storage. Striking exceptions are Norway and Iceland, for which high awareness levels and neutral to positive attitudes towards CCS were reported. If you would like to know why, please stay for the presentation on public awareness and engagement later today. Regarding the storage capacity in Europe, the most recent compilation was done in the CO2 Stop project. However, that project used in most parts only data already existing at that time. In our questionnaires, recent updates of national storage capacity assessments were reported from 25 countries. These are the countries colored here in green or light green. More details will be presented by Vid later on. Also, it was evident from the information we received that the assessment levels differ significantly from country to country. Thus, there is a need to prepare a consolidated, up-to-date European CO2 storage atlas. Preferred storage options in most countries are saline aquifers and depleted or depleting hydrocarbon fields. Iceland is advancing the in situ mineral storage, which is at present only considered as a potential option in Portugal and Greece as well. The use and storage of CO2 in enhanced hydrocarbon recovery projects is an option considered in particular in some countries from Eastern and Central Europe, whereas this technology and the associated prolonged oil production is seen critical in other countries. We find CCS-related projects in Europe with very different foci, scales, and stages. I will give some examples here. More information will be presented later by Connie. As I already mentioned, in operation are at present the two Norwegian large-scale projects at Sleipner and Snøhvit, and the two smaller-scale carb-fix injection sites. Other European storage pilot projects finished operation as planned. The Hontomin pilot project has been on hold since 2018. What is maybe somewhat less well known is that commercial CO2 EOR operations are ongoing in Hungary, Turkey, and Croatia. Also for CO2 capture and transport, there are several test and pilot facilities available in Europe. Recently, various pilots have been developed for capture from different industrial facilities, whereas before the focus was on capturing from power plant flue gases. A large CO2 transport test facility opened in Norway in 2020. There are at present several projects of common interest for cross-border CO2 transport networks on the PCI project list. These are forming nuclei for advancing full-chain CCS projects that in most cases include cluster or storage hub concepts. And the recently established EU Innovation Fund aims to support the development of projects that demonstrate innovative low-carbon technologies. Among the small-scale and large-scale projects selected or already awarded from the first calls are fortunately several that contain CCUS elements. Coming to the research activities. Nearly all assessed countries reported CO2 storage-related research activities or involvement in EU-funded or regional research projects. Research hotspots, which means in our simple assessment, the countries with the highest number of active research institutions are Norway, Poland, UK, and Italy, followed by France, the Netherlands, Portugal, and Spain. Many European countries reported to host large-scale research infrastructure, many of which are part of Excel. The countries participating in Excel are indicated here on this map on the right in turquoise. Also, there are numerous smaller-scale research facilities available in several countries that mainly address CO2 capture. Very few countries have national research programs dedicated to CCS, but in many countries, funding for such research is available in one way or another. Available budgets cover a wide range from funding the setup of real test facilities to PhD support. Thematically, CO2 storage-related research focuses on storage capacity assessments in many countries. In some countries, research focus has been on CO2 capture and/or utilization instead of storage. More specific information will be presented later on by Jan. So in summary, our assessment reveals that CCS is moving forward in Europe. There's a clear progress in bringing CCS back onto national agendas to help to meet climate targets. At the same time, our assessment revealed a wide spread of activities and knowledge levels that indicate that there's a need for pan-European knowledge exchange, research, technology transfer, and cooperation on all aspects of CCS. This will support the rapid deployment of CCS at the scale required for significant CO2 emission reduction in Europe. More detailed information from our assessment will be presented in the following sessions or talks. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for the overview, Heike, and I'm very pleased. I hope you can see that we have many interesting and exciting talks lined up for you today, and I hope that you'll be able to stay with us for the full agenda. I should mention that we will have a short break in the middle because we're aware that this is quite a long time to sit still, and that we will have two question and answer sessions, one after the next block of talks and one at the end. And I would again invite you to please put your questions into the chat for our presenters. And I would also like to say, just before the break, I would also like to take a photo of all of the participants. So I'll give you a shout later on and ask you to switch on your cameras. So without further delay, I would like to hand over to Alexandra, who will now present on European and national policies and climate projection strategies. So Alexandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sari. Hello, everyone, and welcome to my presentation. During this presentation, I will focus on European and national policies and climate protection strategies. So please, before we start, I would like to mention about some issue related to the preparation of this report. As Sari and Heike already said, this report were prepared based as the end of the June 2021. So I would like to draw your attention that some documents have been maybe not changed, but supplemented in case of the some strategies. But I will be talking about this later on. And of course, the documentation that we use to prepare this analysis of the policies and strategies were based by the country-specific information, also mentioned already by Sari, and documents submitted by the individual countries that were obliged to submit those documents to the European Commission. So before we start, some general information about legislation, because as we said, the last CO2GeoNet report was prepared in 2013. So I think that a lot of things already has changed, and a lot of regulations come in force since this period. So, and this implementation resulting of many obligations that the individual countries have to do according to those legislation. Of course, we'll start with the Paris Agreement, that is the well-known document to everyone. But apart the guideline of the limiting emissions, I would like to draw your attention about the obligation to prepare the long-term strategies arising from these documents, and I will give you some information about this during this presentation and showing next slide. Of course, very important document for the European Union, European Green Deal. So we know that Europe would like to be the climate neutral continent by 2015. And of course, we have to mention about the obligation of 55 reduction of the greenhouse gases required to 2030. And this is associated with the climate target plan. So in this place, I would like to also mention that within the this European Green Deal, it's a board agreement across the public stakeholders and the international analysis of EU decarbonization pathways. And we have to mention this moment the CCS is showed that will be needed to scale the the needed at scale to decarbonize the energy-intensive industries. Of course, as was mentioned, a lot of work, a lot of projects, and a lot of goals were achieved during this period that we are analyzing within this report. So it's good to know about this. Some analyses also see the conventional electricity generation retrofitted with CCS, so it's also very important information. The next regulation is the Fit to 55 package that it's related also with the limits of the emission after earlier mentioned 55% by 2030. And the last but not least, regulation Clean Energy for All Europeans package. This is the set of eight legislative acts on the energy performance of buildings, renewable energy, energy efficiency, governance, and electricity market design. And what is important in this package, that from this package, we as EU members, we are obliged to, countries are obliged to prepare the national energy and climate plans. Let's start with this national energy and climate plans. So, as I mentioned, EU countries were obliged. I'm saying were because the deadline for this preparation we have already. So according to provisions included in this Clean Energy for Europeans package, each EU country is required to establish this integrated 10-year national energy climate package for the years 2021-2030. And this package, these plans have to be prepared for each 10 years period. So if we look at the slide, I provide you with the link to this to the EU page where you can find the list of the countries that which submitted these national plans. For now, of course, we have the all plans submitted to the Commission, but it's not the same with the long-term strategies. I will go further. So let's move to the national long-term strategies. Those strategies are crucial to help achieve the economic transformation needed and border sustainable development goals, as well as move towards the long-term goals set by the Paris Agreement. About these long-term goals that are described in the Paris Agreement, I will provide you with the information within the next 2 slides. So all parties to the Paris Agreement were invited to communicate by 2020 the mid-century long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategies. In case of the EU and member states, this long-term strategy have to be prepared every 10 years thereafter, and the okay, I mentioned that this plans for the strategy was the 2021 and 2030, and if we see on this slide, once again, I will provide you with the link to the list of the countries that already submitted the national long-term strategies. So when we were preparing this report, we had 20 EU member states listed in this website. Now we have 22. So as I mentioned on the beginning, it's really worth to see time by time to this website and be with line of what's happened there, because if some country will make some changes, these changes will be shown on the website as well. And very important long-term strategies that it's a wider one, because it's including entire the countries that signed the Paris Agreement. So here we have the link to the long-term low greenhouse gases emission development strategies, LEDC. And I was checking this this number today morning. So up to date, we have 50 LEDC strategies submitted to the UNFCCC Secretariat, and not all EU members countries submitted their long-term strategies. So all those documents and all information provided by our CO2 GeoNet members, but and also the people who are not associated, countries are not associated, but we received these cards. So all these documents and all this information that we were provided with, we use for the preparation of the information what is included in the national and long-term strategies of each country. So when analyzing the 27 NECP submitted by EU member states to the EC, we found that 20 of them mentioned plans and possibility for use the CCS technology as a CO2 emission reduction option. In some countries, only the part of the CCS chain, for example, capture, is being considered, and is very important because documents differ from each other and requires very careful analysis and to find the appropriate information there. So in case of long-term strategies, 22 out of 27 countries has reported to the EC, and CCS technology is included in long-term strategy of Italy, Lithuania, the Netherlands, Slovakia, Spain, Sweden, Austria, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, and Hungary. As I mentioned, it should be noted that the majority of the cases, the strategies mentioned are possibly consideration of CCS without detailed specification and unfortunately without clear implementation plans. So to make some short conclusions, because all those information you will find in the CO2 GeoNet report that we present today. So all those analyses show the wide variation in goals defined in the strategic documents by individual countries. It reflects the present-day characteristic, for example, national economic structure, energy mixes, domestic energy sources, and gross domestic product level. As for the main objectives related to the low zero emission goals, differences between the target individual countries are clearly visible. For instance, for the reduction of no-emission trading system, greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 compared with 2005, only few countries decided on the high reduction target of 40% or more. Some of the countries have very low targets, as up to even less than 10%. In case of the energy security, which refers to reduced reliance of important fossil fuels, in some countries, quantified objectives are not set. 100% of renewable electricity generation by 2030, 2040, and 2050 is indicated by Austria, Sweden, and Denmark only. If we're going to the CCS, and the individual member states differs significantly from support for research activities, national storage capacity assessments, and feasibility studies to implementation of specific large-scale CCS project. The focus of CCS application has shifted in many countries from the capture at fossil-fired power plants to capture and industrial facilities and other alternative emitter sources, for example, the waste incineration plants to geothermal energy production. Some countries undertake a number of activities in the area of the CCS, but this happens, let's say, outside of the strategies. So I mean, some projects, research joint initiative, but all those projects and initiative will be described within this meeting in describing next chapters of our report. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, for the report that clearly shows sort of policy is moving forward. We see policies that will enable CO2 storage, and that's a really important aspect for CO2. We need to be sure that we need it, and we want, as research, to provide the information to allow policymakers to make these decisions about what role CCS can play. And we hope that they see how important CCS can be in meeting our climate targets. So thank you very much for this excellent presentation. And I will now hand back to Heike to give us the next session on national and international legislation and regulations with respect to CO2 storage. So first we have the policy to tell us, to encourage us to do this, and then we have the legislation and regulations to tell us how we're going to do this in each country. So Heike, over to you.
Yes, hello again. So in this presentation, I will provide some more insights in the findings from our assessment regarding national and international legislation and regulations with respect to CO2 storage. Let's start at the international level. The London Protocol was set up to prevent pollution of the marine environment by dumping of waste and other matters, except for some acceptable wastes. These acceptable wastes are specified in the so-called reverse list that originally did not include CO2. This was changed in 2006. The London Protocol also prohibits the export of waste and other matter for dumping, and thus it prohibits the CO2 export. So to enable CO2 export, or in other words, the transboundary transport of CO2 offshore, Article 6 of the London Protocol was amended in 2009. However, to come into force, this amendment has to be accepted by 2/3 of the contracting parties. By the end of January 2022, only 8 parties did so, mainly from Europe. To still rapidly enable cross-border CO2 transport, the possibility of a provisional application of this amendment was agreed on in October 2019. For this, agreements between the countries concerned have to be made and deposited at the International Maritime Organization. This procedure is only possible for parties to the London Protocol. So in summary, cross-border CO2 transport to offshore CO2 storage sites is now permissible. Two regional conventions are also very important for CO2 storage projects in Europe, namely the OSPAR Convention for the Northeast Atlantic area and the Helsinki Convention for the Baltic Sea area. Both conventions aim at protecting the marine environment in the respective regions. For the OSPAR Convention in 2007, amendments to the annexes were adopted to allow storage of CO2 in geological formations under the seabed. The OSPAR Convention prohibits the storage of CO2 streams in the water column or on the seabed. The Helsinki Convention prohibits the disposal of waste on the Baltic Sea, and as yet, CO2 is not exempted from the list of wastes or explicitly exempted from the prohibition of dumping. So an amendment is probably necessary here to enable CO2 storage under the seabed of the Baltic Sea. Coming now to more CO2 storage specific laws, namely the EU Ccs Directive. This was transposed into national legislation by all EU member states between 2010 and 2014, at that time still including the UK. Also Norway transposed the directive in 2014. In Iceland, the government has adopted the transposition recently, including the necessary adaptations to the conditions and requirements for CO2 mineral storage in basalt formation. In 4 of the assessed countries, there is no national legislation in place for CO2 geological storage. So as of June 2021, the geological storage of CO2 was permitted in 19 out of the 32 countries assessed. These are the countries indicated here on the map in green and light green. Some countries, those in light green, exclude specific regions or impose certain limitations. These include, for example, storage only being allowed offshore in Sweden, or the exclusion of areas of known seismic and volcanic activities in Italy, or the exclusion of underground aquifers in Greece. Further, in some countries, the national state is allowed to restrict the area for storage sites or for site exploration. This is the case in Hungary, Poland, and the Slovak Republic. In 9 countries, CO2 storage is prohibited or not possible. These are indicated here in red. The 4 countries marked in yellow are those without specific CO2 storage laws. In Denmark, here in orange, CO2 storage is currently prohibited except for EOR projects offshore. A comparison between the present day situation here on the left and the situation in 2012 on the right shows no clear trend. For example, while in Sweden and the Czech Republic CO2 storage is now permissible, CO2 storage is now forbidden or not possible in Lithuania, Slovenia, and Germany. Please note that in this comparison, the categories are not entirely the same. More specifically, in Sweden, CO2 storage was forbidden until 2013. This ban was lifted by new laws and their amendments so that now larger scale CO2 storage offshore is permitted. In the Czech Republic, the time limit prohibiting CO2 storage expired on January the 1st, 2020. So CO2 storage is now permissible there. On the contrary, Lithuania prohibited CO2 storage in July 2020 by a new law, and in Slovenia, CO2 storage has been prohibited since November 2013. This ban in Slovenia also applies to CO2 injection for research purposes. In some countries, the situation is somewhat more complex. In Germany, CO2 storage is not possible at present, as the deadline for filing CO2 storage permit applications expired by the end of 2016. In addition, some German federal states banned CO2 storage within their territory. In Slovakia, the National CO2 Storage Act in principle enables CO2 storage. However, at the same time, there are other regulations in place that protect priority areas for other subsurface uses, and thereby they significantly limit possible locations of CO2 storage sites. Similarly, in Poland, CO2 storage is only allowed for demonstration projects and with further limitations arising from the implementation acts to the Polish geological and mining law that only allow offshore storage, still with further limitations. So in consequence, CO2 storage is currently only permissible in the Cambrian reservoir within the Polish exclusive economic zone. For Denmark and Ireland, both currently prohibiting CO2 storage, there were indications for revisions of their national laws. Denmark plans to permit large-scale CO2 storage offshore and onshore during 2022. The current situation is that since 2011, Denmark has had a moratorium for CO2 storage, both onshore and offshore, except in the case of CO2 EOR projects. And this moratorium also affected the CO2 injection for research purposes. Now, Denmark actually considers banning CO2 EOR and intends to phase out hydrocarbon production. For Ireland, no specific information on the anticipated changes was reported. What is also important for implementing CO2 storage project is the ownership of the subsurface. In the assessed countries, the subsurface is either owned by the state or the people collectively, or it belongs to the individual landowners who own the land down to the Earth's center. However, in many countries in which the latter is the case, certain raw materials and the geological structures bearing them are excluded from the landowner's claim. If this is not the case, like for example in Latvia, storage permits from many landowners would be required for onshore CO2 storage if storage wasn't forbidden there anyway. CO2 storage is licensed and regulated on a national, federal, state level in 15 countries and at a regional level in 4 countries by the designated authorities or agencies. For the other 13 countries, no information was available or the relevant authority has not been defined. Across Europe, there's very limited experience with licensing procedures for CO2 storage. Only Norway has practical experience with operational industrial scale CO2 storage sites. The operations at Sleip and Snøhvit were originally regulated under the Norwegian acts relevant for emissions from petroleum activities. The projects were relicensed according to the provisions of the EU Ccs Directive in 2017 and 2018. In addition, some storage licenses have been recently awarded for prospective new storage sites in Norway, the Netherlands, and UK. Denmark reported a declined license pre-application from 2011. In some other countries, some storage licenses and permits based on various national laws and regulations were granted for smaller scale and pilot projects. As only some upcoming projects have moved forward to exploration and characterization to date, the experience with awarding exploration permits for CO2 storage is also quite limited. So sharing of experiences could be very helpful here, both for operators and regulators. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Heike. And I think it's really interesting to see the different approaches taken by countries to CO2 legislation and how complicated it becomes to fit something new into the existing legislation within a country. And so it's you again, Heike, I see. So Heike will go on to the presentation on national actors driving CCS forward and public engagement, after which we will have a question and answer session. So please drop your questions into the chat for the speakers to answer. So Heike, back to you.
Yeah. Do you see my screen?
Yep, we can see your slides in presentation mode.
Okay, fine. So yes, it's me again. So in the next minutes, I will present you our findings on who are the national actors driving CCS forward and what can we say about public awareness in Europe, and I will show you some examples for public engagement. Before I go into any details, I would again like to emphasize that the presented information is largely based on the personal perceptions and experiences of the individual authors, as scientific surveys were not available in the literature for all countries or projects. Thus, no clear statistics and rating could be given, and only tendencies and trends are reported on a more general level. And the yeah, general statements should be treated with some care. As I already mentioned in the previous presentation, in many European countries, the awareness and knowledge about the technology, CCS technology within the general public is low to very low. These are all the countries colored here in gray and light blue. Higher awareness levels were reported for a few countries only, colored in the darker blues. The topic climate change has a somewhat higher awareness, but details like drivers for climate change, potential consequences, as well as the magnitude of changes required to meet climate targets are also quite poorly understood by the general public. At the same time, in many countries, CCS is often perceived as a risky technology, largely due to its unfamiliarity. For industrial and political stakeholders, somewhat higher awareness and knowledge, together with a more positive perception, was reported for many countries. In several European countries, the media coverage of CCS technology has slightly to moderately increased in recent years. This was in particular the case during the negotiations on the national CO2 emission reduction targets and the measures to reach these targets. In the countries marked here with stripes, informing and engaging the local public living around pilot projects has led to a higher local awareness and a better acceptance of CCS. Such successful information and engagement of the local public living around the respective projects has been reported for the projects at Hontermine, Ketzin, Cork, and Hellisheide. It was actually found that the better the knowledge about the technology was, the more the project and CCS in general was accepted by the local population. Some social scientific studies revealed that the characteristics of the relational context in which the people came to learn about CCS or the pilot project were an important factor for how the technology or the project was perceived. An open, interactive format which allowed for exchange and discussions favored acceptance. In contrast, a more frontal approach and imposition of projects appeared to stimulate reactions of rejection. If you recall the map, striking exceptions in the public awareness were Norway and Iceland. But what is so different about CCS in these countries? In Norway, the relatively high public awareness and knowledge about the CCS technology can in part be attributed to the government's investment in high-profile projects such as the Technology Center Mongstad, TCM, and the Norwegian full-scale CCS demonstration project Longship, including the Northern Lights project. The fact that CO2 storage in Norway will be carried out offshore presumably also increases public acceptance. So as a result, there's actually a broad political consensus in favor of CCS among major political players, including the trade unions and the Confederation of Norwegian Enterprises. In Iceland, in Iceland, the CCS technology in general, and in particular the CarbFix technology involving CO2 mineralization in basalt, is widely known and its public acceptance is very high. This can be related, among other things, to numerous public information and engagement activities. Likely rationales for the high acceptance of the CarbFix technology in Iceland include that, first of all, it is based on processes that also occur in nature, It involves a rapid mineralization of CO2, thereby significantly reducing the risk of CO2 leakage. Also, it helped public acceptance that the CarbFix technology has been developed at a geothermal plant that is in the renewable energy sector. And actually, CarbFix managed to achieve that its technology is perceived as an Icelandic brand within the energy and utility sector. In some countries, the perception of CO2 storage depends on the overall project concept. Public perception was reported to be more positive if CCS was applied not for CO2 emissions from fossil-fired power plants, but for hard-to-abate process emissions from industry, to renewable energy sources like geothermal plants, to the production of blue hydrogen. Applying CCS for such sources is seen as a potentially acceptable emission reduction measure in some countries, whereas CCS on power is considered an obstacle to advancing the transition from fossil-based towards a renewable energy-based system in these countries. Storage offshore is often perceived as less risky than onshore storage and therefore has a somewhat higher acceptance, in particular in coastal countries. And what I forgot to mention, the option to achieve negative emissions also in many countries increases the acceptance of the overall technology. In some countries, CO2 capture and utilization receives more attention from the public and politicians than CO2 storage. Likely reasons for this include the potential economic benefits of CCU and CCU being seen as a value-creating technological option for CO2 emission reduction. Also, CCU is seen in some countries as an essential building block for an envisaged circular economy. A further advantage can be that capturing CO2 on its own is more straightforward to regulate. In particular, in countries without a suitable geology or where legislation forbids CO2 storage, CCU could be an attractive option to reduce CO2 emissions. However, it should be noted that the potential for CO2 emission reduction of any type of CCU strongly depends on the permanence of the CO2 fixation in the final product, the scale of applicability, and the overall lifetime carbon footprint of the technology. The use of CO2 for enhanced oil recovery from depleting reservoirs is ongoing on a commercial scale in Croatia, Hungary, and Turkey. There are different views on this technology. In some cases, in particular in countries from Eastern and Central Europe, CO2 EOR is seen as a good opportunity to kickstart broader CCUS activities. In some other countries, the continued oil production by CO2 EOR is regarded with some skepticism in terms of its climate impact. Coming back to the question, who's advocating CCS in the individual countries? That's quite different in the various countries. Reported national advocates include the national CO2 clubs and networks. Such exist in Spain, Romania, Italy, France, the Netherlands, UK, and Norway. You see some of their logos down at the bottom of this slide. Other national advocates can be the national scientific or engineering academies, think tanks, or governmental fora. Such were reported from Denmark, Germany, Ireland, Sweden, and Norway. Also, individual institutions such as geological surveys or specific research institutions, can advocate for CCS, or the national representatives of regional networks such as BESREX or ENERG. And last but not least, it can be national representatives of emission-intensive industries. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Heike. It is certainly an important topic for CCS to consider how CCS is perceived and how it fits within all of the options available to reduce emissions. So I would like to now move on to the question and answer session. So again, please post your questions in the chat. So firstly, I'll go to Alexandra and ask you, so from your chapter, what did you see as the key point that shows progress or will help progress with CO2 storage?
Okay, thank you, Sarah. So if we analyze the last period, I mean the period when the last report was prepared. So because I'm closely involved in the CCS technology in our institute, in the national level, as well as I was maybe not part, but I was close to the preparation of the energy policy, and these elements that are very good, and this is that we are not so scared right now about this technology, and this is big progress in case of the social awareness to this technology. What is wrong and not very nice is that in case of Poland, the legislation blocked us, as Heike said, that we can only store CO2 offshore, and with a lot of limitation from the geological and mining law and the environmental law and so on. So it's not very attractive location for us. And additionally, all biggest emitters in Poland are located in the sur of Poland. Yeah, so it's worth to. We have made some analysis of the possible location of the CO2 storage in the sur of the Poland, but as I mentioned, we cannot do an even project to check these structures because of the legislation. But what is good, we are involved in many projects, a lot of initiative, as not only as my institute, but a lot of Polish institute and institutions. And we would like to be, let's say, prepared when the legislation will change, because if you take into consideration the Polish energy mix, the CCS and CCU, but CCS is one of the options to meet the requirements of the climate policy of EU. So we have to be with line with everything, and we have to be prepared, as I mentioned. So, but I think a lot of change, because we are aware of what this technology is, and we are really active in the European and international market, let's say CCS market.
Thank you, Alexandra. I like this idea that you are poised and ready for when things change. Very, very good. And Heike, I would like to ask the same question to you, but you have two chapters to choose from. So I would like to ask you, what did you see as the key point that shows progress or that will help progress in CCS?
Well, what I found very striking from the public awareness assessments, so to say, was the statement that around the pilot project, it was found that the more the people actually know and understand the technology, the higher the acceptance was. And I think this is something we should always have in mind, and probably we need to scale up our efforts to communicate about the technology. And I know that this is not always possible, and sometimes it's difficult to get back to a, well, knowledge or fact-based discussion, but we shouldn't give up trying.
Very good. I think we see this with other technologies as well, that where there is a real effort to communicate with particularly those who will host the projects, that there's less concerns where there's more knowledge, and that early and transparent engagement and talking to the right people is really critical for getting any large project working. I see we have another question in the chat about Germany specifically, so I think this one is for you, Heike. They asked, did I miss the point on the present situation or regulation for subseabed CO2 storage in Germany?
According to my understanding, but I'm not an expert on this, well, the KSPG, so the German National CO2 Storage Law, applies to, well, both onshore and offshore, so it covers the entire territory, including the exclusive economic zone. And so, as well, there is this time limit. Well, according to my understanding, CO2 storage is not permissible there as well at present.
Thank you,
so if there's anyone in the audience who knows better, please correct me.
Yes, the question did come from Manfred Trevor, so you may wish to say something on that point. But if not, I'll move on to another question that was in the chat, which is just to say that the slides will be made available through the CO2GeoNet website after the webinar. And I have another question for Heike again. So for countries where CO2 storage is not permitted, do we see an appetite to store CO2 elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely the case for Germany, and yeah, I mean, also for other countries that for quite some time didn't permit CO2 storage, or for, of course, for those who don't have well, the geological conditions to store at all. There are yes, definitely activities to, well, find regional or by multilateral cooperations for large-scale CO2 storage projects.
So if I can add something to this, because it's a case of Poland as well, yeah, and we are close looking for the Aurora project, Norwegian one. They prepared the sites for the storage from the, I think, European countries as well. So some very preliminary assessment of the transportation, not because of this project, but because of the one of the scenario if the storage will not be permitted in localization of Poland. So we also made some kind of the preliminary transportation project analysis, how to transport CO2 in the safely and economically way to other countries to store it. So of course it's problem of other countries as well, but it's possible.
Very much so. I love your optimism, and I think this is what drives CCS forward. I've been working in CO2 storage for about 20 years, and I've seen the dip, and I hope I am now seeing the rise again of CCS. So we're going to have a short 5-minute break to allow our speakers to recover and for everybody to go grab a coffee. But invite you to our 15th Open Forum in Venice. So we are aiming for an in-person event, and we very much hope that you'll be interested in joining us. So we will now move on with the technical presentations today, and I'm going to hand over to Vit to talk to us about the assessment of storage options potential and capacity in Europe. Over to you, Vit.
Thank you, Carrie, and Good afternoon from Brno. I hope that you can see my screen. Can you please confirm?
Yes, but not in presentation mode.
Ah, okay.
Slightly different on every platform, so we have to test it out.
Someone must start with the technical issues, of course. So.
Yeah, today it's you. Okay, we still see it, or I still see it in normal slide view. That's it. Now it's on to presentation mode.
Okay, that's good. So hello once again. I'm going to talk about the chapter of our report that deals with assessment of storage option potential and capacity in Europe. And I'm also going to add a few personal remarks that will go a bit beyond the report. So if we look at the pan-European assessment of CO2 storage potential, then we have to start with a short historical excursion, because this will help us to understand the current status, the status quo. So the activities are as old as the injection at Sleipner. They started in 1996 with CO2, which was the third framework program, and continued with GESTCO in the fifth framework program, and a small part of the Castor project in FP6, and culminated by the EU geocapacity project in 2006 to 2008. It was also part of the sixth framework program, and I am pleased to see some eyewitnesses of this remarkable project in our audience. And the final, or the last pan-European effort was the CO2 Stop projects, already mentioned earlier. So if we look at EU geocapacity, this was the most comprehensive activity of mapping the pan-European CO2 storage potential to date. It covered 25 countries. The comprehensive country reports were produced, as well as some case studies. And the main result is a GIS-linked pan-European database of CO2 storage potential that includes both public and confidential data that were made available for the project only, and therefore it was not possible to make the database fully available in the public domain, unfortunately. The project reports are still available on the project website. And I'm proud to say that this is a Czech Geological Survey taking care of this website. And the project also brought some first pan-European estimation of European CO2 storage potential that you can see here in the slide, like 96 gigaton storage capacity in saline aquifers, 20 gigatons in hydrocarbon fields, and 1 gigaton in unminable coal beds. And if we compare it with the European industrial emissions, the figure here is from 2019. Which is 587 million tons of industrial emissions. And we can say that if we take just 1/10 of the identified capacity, we can easily store 20 years of total European industrial emissions in the storage sites identified in the project. The CO2 Stop in 2012-2013 was a slight follow-up of EU geocapacity. Its main goal was to establish a database of publicly available data on CO2 storage potential, but the project had a limited budget, and therefore only existing data could have been used. It covered 27 countries, so more than EU geocapacity, but in any case, EU geocapacity data were largely used. The confidential data were removed from the database. Some countries provided updates, but not too many. These updates were largely based on work funded at national level, and some improved methodology for storage potential was developed here in the project. But there were no pan-European results published in the CO2 Stop report. And the reason was that the project results also included, in addition to a CO2 storage database and GIS application, a calculation engine capable of providing some probabilistic estimates of CO2 storage capacity, and also a data analysis and interrogation tools that was able to perform some calculations with stochastic analysis. The data were for quite some time housed by the EC Joint Research Center in Peten, and they were made broadly available to the public only in 2020. And now they are publicly available online on the EGDI map portal of EuroGeoSurveys. EuroGeoSurveys is the organization of European Geological Surveys, and this is a screenshot from the EGDI portal. EGDI stands for European Geological Data Infrastructure. And you can find here the CO2 stop data under the geoenergy topic. And you can see that for CO2 storage, there are 3 levels of data. The largest green units are so-called the largest blue units are the so-called formation, and then there are more detailed structures on the second level storage units, and on the third level these are the so-called daughter units, and these are of 2 types, aquifer and hydrocarbon daughter units. And if I'm able to move the slide, I don't know if the slide moved because moved only in one of my screens. So
we see CO2 Stop Results at EDGI portal.
Yeah, but the title is the same for both of them.
Okay, we see some analysis, then we see a little box with details.
Do you see some detail with Denmark and Northern Germany?
Middle Bundesland sign, yes. And Germany, yes.
Yeah, so that's an example of what the portal shows. So it's a WebGIS, so you can of course get the information from the database by clicking on the structure, and you get some information related to the structures you have clicked on. And on the bottom you can see the link where you can find the data. So now, and this is an additional information on top of the report, because this appeared already after our report was finalized. The CO2 stop results were published, I would say finally, in October 2021 by an effort of our colleagues at JOS in Denmark on the contract for the Clean Air Task Force, which is an environmental organization based in the US, but also with activities in Europe. And here the Danish colleagues took the effort and calculated the storage capacities for whole Europe based on the CO2 stop data, and you can see the results here. So there is a big capacity of almost 500 gigatons in saline aquifers, but in these storage units, which are the broader structures, and because not all countries were able to identify these daughter units, so there is also another figure for these daughter units in aquifers and hydrocarbon fields. And again, on the bottom you can see the link to the report. So what developments were reported by our contributors in the report? It was already mentioned before, most of the European countries reported updates in storage capacity evaluations, 25 countries. And this is, in our understanding, a strong argument for the value of a new pan-European CO2 storage atlas. These updates range from zero storage capacity assessments or reassessments on country or even transnational levels to updates focusing on selected regions or clusters of potential storage sites. I will show you in the next slide some notable examples of new developments. There are mostly in the countries in Northern and Northwestern Europe, but also, for instance, in Spain. And in addition, significant developments on storage capacity assessment were reported on national level from Hungary, Ireland, Italy, and the Netherlands, to say a few examples. Those are these promised notable examples development. So this is a Nordic CO2 storage atlas, quite famous already. It covered Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland. This is a CO2 stored database of the UK. And last but not least, the CO2 storage atlas, the Norwegian continental shelf, which of course is not only this remarkable book, but also has an online web-based version. This map shows an overview of the status of CO2 storage potential assessment in European countries. So the highest level is dark green. These are countries that have a comprehensive national CO2 storage atlas database or catalog available. And in this category, we can find 8 countries: Denmark, Germany, Iceland, Norway, Poland, Spain, Sweden, and the UK. Good knowledge with recent updates is reported by 16 countries. These are marked in light green. And similarly, good knowledge, but without recent updates, was reported by Belgium, Bulgaria, and Slovenia. And for 3 countries in our overview, there were ongoing or yet incomplete assessment in place, or even poor or lacking knowledge. And 2 countries, Estonia and Finland, reported generally 0 storage capacity due to unfavorable geology. So if we look at storage options, most of the countries consider saline aquifers and depleted or depleting hydrocarbon fields as prevailing opportunities for CO2 storage. The CO2 EOR in 3 countries has been already mentioned. Here I would maybe add that the history of CO2 EOR in Hungary is similarly old as in the US, dates back to the 1970s. Offshore sites are the preferred location for storage in most coastal countries, with, of course, focus on the North Sea as a region where the largest European storage potential has been identified so far. 5 countries reported also storage capacity in coal seams, but this option has not been developed recently. And as already mentioned, Iceland is a pioneer and advocate of in situ mineral storage in mafic and ultramafic rocks, but according to the latest developments, also in other types of crystalline rocks using this Carbfix technology, where CO2 is dissolved in water before or during its injection. And the Carbfix colleagues already produced a worldwide mineral storage atlas that highlights suitable geological formations for mineral storage in Europe and worldwide, and this is a screenshot of this atlas. So what can we expect as a way forward? Of course, it's expected that the progress in storage capacity evaluation will go on based on both public and private money. And as mentioned already several times, in our understanding of the current situation, a new European CO2 storage atlas is necessary if we take the recent progress and the expected development of CCS into account. And this need has been highlighted by the research community long time ago, and you might remember the position paper by ENERG, the European Network for Research in Geoenergy, that dates back already to 2012 and was also endorsed by Co2GeoNet, and is titled "The Need for a CO2 Geological Storage European Atlas." And this need is reflected also in the EU set plan, the Strategy Energy Technology plan of the Union. And it's action number 9 on CCS and CCU, because one of the key technologies had in the implementation plan, the activity number 4, establish a European CO2 storage atlas, which the intention to be completed by 2020. And we can now discuss if this objective was achieved by the publication of the CO2 Stop database or not. I put here the question mark. And this target stays there in the set plan, in the updated set plan, looking at the target number 5 for CCS and CCU, an up-to-date and detailed inventory of the most suitable and cost-effective geological storage capacity based on agreed methodology. And this update of the set plan is supported by the CCUS roadmap to 2030 that was published by the implementation working group of the set plan last year. And here you can find an action saying priority regions for appraisal should be identified using the proposed online open access European Storage Atlas as a foundation. So the objective, in my understanding, is still there. And in our report, we stated that we do not see any action that could bring us towards these objectives in the next years. This is still true, but on the other hand, there is one activity by the European Commission that, let's say, can be added to our report. And this is the call of the Horizon Europe program that is titled Support to the Activities of the European Geological Services. And this call has been already closed in January, and now the proposals are under evaluation. And if you can see, this is very small, unfortunately, sorry about that. But if you look closely at the topic description, so you can find among the expected outcome comprehensive inventory of information on capacities for CO2 sequestration, as it's stated here. But here we have to mention that deploying and maintaining a European Storage Atlas for CO2 is only one of the 12 key issues to be addressed by this call and the resulting project, together with other important topics like critical raw materials, groundwater, other types of geoenergy, including geothermal and so on. So we can discuss, or we can think about if this action is the right one to bring us towards the desired objective, to the new comprehensive CO2 storage atlas of Europe that would be comparable with, for instance, what we can see in the North American CO2 storage atlas. So by that, I think I can conclude my presentation. I think there are some topics that are really ready for discussion. So that is at the end of the webinar. So for the moment, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Vid. Thank you for tackling the thorny issue of a pan-European CO2 storage atlas as well. I'm sure we will have some questions on that later. And I will now hand over to Connie, who's going to talk to us about practical demonstration of CCS at large scale, demonstration scale and pilot scale. So Connie, over to you. I can see your slides, but not presentation mode. And now in presentation mode, over to you.
Okay, so you can see this? That's fine. Yeah, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I want to introduce you into another chapter of our report. So this is chapter 5, which reports on the large scale and demonstration CCS projects, pilot and test sites for CO2 capture, transport and storage. So our report focuses on the storage projects, but capture and transport is also included to complement our overview about the projects and activities which are relevant for implementing the whole CCUS technology. So I want to start here with an overview how we classify the different projects. So in the table, you see that we distinguish between the large-scale projects. So here we understand projects that enable CO2 capture and injection rates of more than 400 kilotons of CO2 per year. So which is quite common for processes from the industry, the fertilizer, the cement or paper and pulp industry, or about 800 kilotons CO2 per year if it comes from power generation. Then we have demonstration projects. So these are projects which have a capture or injection rate of less than the 400 kilotons CO2 per year, but with overall total amount more than 100 kilotons of CO2 stored in the underground. And the pilots are those which have an overall amount of less than 100,000 tons of CO2 captured and injected. So we heard today already that these are the well-known pilots as from the Roos field, from Katzin, Hontamin, and others. So here we are based on the definition from the Global CCS Institute and also from another publication given at the bottom of the slide. So we heard a lot about the political and economic realities in Europe. So I only want to sum it up to give the background how our different projects in different sizes have been evolved. So the situation between 2010 and 17 was characterized by some cutbacks in public funding, in lack of comprehensive climate policies, and also a too low carbon price. So we had prices around €5 per ton CO2, and this was not the right rationale for economic actors to invest in the CCS technology. So, but with the perspective to achieving the climate and energy targets for 2030 and beyond, the EU has launched the new program. We heard about this today, the EU Innovation Fund. So this came in the past years, and it replaces the former NER 300 and could be seen now as an additional stimulus for preparing new CO2 storage projects. So we heard in the presentation of Heike that a lot of large-scale projects took place, and a number of projects are foreseen for awarding. Some others are foreseen for a second stage, but a majority of projects is related to CO2 utilization, to capture, transport, and utilization. So we would wish to have more storage projects. So our intensive study of country-specific information, which is given in the annex of our state of play report, shows us significant variations among the assessed European countries. And we learned already today that we have different reasons for the variations in the developments. So we have, for instance, that CCS is not part of the national climate protection policy, or that there is a lack of awareness of the technology and its impact, or we have insufficient geological storage capacity. This is also a reason, or other socio-economic issues. So if we look on the map, we have already seen today, here we can see the different CO2 capture, transport, and storage projects on all scales and at all stages of planning and development, including the full chain and also the cluster projects. So if we look to the legend, then we see the dots, the brown dots, that these are projects of common interest, the so-called Pcis. And then mostly the countries driving such a projects are also engaged in the full chain or cluster projects. So we should note that here in this graphic, the most advanced project in the country is reflected. That means countries which have a full chain project in operation may have also other projects as CO2 storage, capture, or only small research projects. So then we have the green colored countries with full chain and cluster projects, the blue colored countries with large scale demo or pilot projects. We have dark gray colored countries which have large scale demo or pilots for capture and transport. And in orange, we have indicated the CO2 EOR projects in operation. So we heard already about this, that this is more in Central and Southern Europe. And then we have also in light yellow research projects and test beds, and then also in a few countries with the light gray, no progress since our very recent report. So let me mention briefly the Pcis in Europe. So we have first the CO2 sapling project driven by United Kingdom and in further phases also by Netherlands and Norway. Here we have a transportation infrastructure component of the Acorn full chain project and its follow-up of international CO2 transportation network in the North Sea basin. Then we know also the CO2 Transport project, which is around the ports of Rotterdam and Antwerp, and together with a transport into the Dutch P18 gas fields and other North Sea storage sites. Then the well-known Northern Lights project, very often mentioned today, driven by Norway and seen as a commercial transport connection project between several European capture initiatives, where CO2 is carried by ships to a hub and then pipelined to a designated storage site on the Norwegian continental shelf with plans for further expansion. Then we know also about the Atos project, the Amsterdam IJmuiden CO2 transport hub and offshore storage, and also the Area Cork project of Ireland, which purposes to repurpose onshore and offshore existing natural gas pipelines and also supports here a transport network from the heavy industry and to gas-fired power plants across to the offshore Kinsale gas field. So this brings me now to a more condensed overview that we have projects of different foci, scale, and also stages. The projects of common interest are already mentioned, and now I want to shed some light on the other project types so that we can see in detail some examples. For instance, here, when we have a look on the large-scale full-chain CCS projects. So we heard also from the other speakers today that we have here the well-known large-scale full-chain projects in operation, which are the Sleipner and the Snøhvit project in Norway. And we have a couple of new projects in various planning and implementation stages in other countries. So here in the puzzle piece, you see the countries as in the typical ISO abbreviation. We have here in the UK, the Scotland Net Zero Infrastructure. We have also the Northern Endurance Partnership. And then we heard about the Greensand project in Denmark. And also an example is the Ravenna hub in Italy. So this brings us now to the next project. These are capture projects and capture test facilities. The capture projects and test facilities are of various sizes and are in operation in several countries with further capture demonstration and pilot plants. So here have most of the capture projects industrial plants aside. So we know about the Dunkirk project in France. We know also about the Preems Lysekil refinery in Sweden. And we have also a cement producer in Aalborg in Denmark. And we know the Norsum factory in Brevik, Norway, which is one of the provider to the Northern Light project. But we have also CO2 captured from waste incinerators. One example is here the Fortum Varme project in Norway. And we have also the geothermal plants and coupled with direct air capture, as we learned from the Carbfix project in Iceland in cooperation with Switzerland for the direct air capture technology. In the same light, we have also assessed from our member countries that a lot of research activities are ongoing on adapting and advancing the CO2 capture process, and this has been reported during the last years. If we have a closer look on the CO2 transport pipelines, then we see that we have transport in operation already in 3 European countries. So we have pipelines for the Snøhvit project in Norway, which brings the processed CO2 back to the Barents Sea field, about 150 kilometers. So we have also the new Northern Light project in Norway with a pipeline for bringing the CO2 from the hub where it is shipped and then transported to the designated storage field. And we know the OCAP project from the Netherlands, which has a supply network to greenhouse-based farming, where the CO2 is used. And this is also becoming part of the Rotterdam project. So we heard also about the enhanced oil recovery project in Croatia. Here we have also a pipeline to transport the CO2 to the Ivanic and Šutica oil fields. So further facilities are ongoing or in action for research on CO2 transport. So also another country is listed here, it's France, to study these transport issues. If we look closer to the CO2 storage sites, then we end again in our well-known sites in operation in Norway, which are Sleipner and Snøhvit. So nevertheless, we have also seen that the basalts in Iceland are very favorable for the in situ mineralization. And so we have also ongoing storage in Iceland on a smaller scale. And we can here also count the reinjection of CO2 from geothermal energy production, which is tested in Turkey, and should be also considered if at the end of the life cycle, CO2 is also remaining for permanent storage in such a field. So different new storage sites are under development, as we have seen as part of the full chain or cluster projects, as mentioned here in UK, the Netherlands, or Denmark. So my colleague has mentioned before the importance of the enhanced oil recovery. And here I want to shed again light on the three major countries in the more southern part of Europe. So this is Hungary with a long tradition, as Vit already mentioned, as similar in the United States since the 70s, Turkey since the 80s, and Croatia since 2010. And we have especially an ACT-funded project, the so-called EcoBase, which has clearly demonstrated a lower carbon footprint for CO2 EOR produced oil. The implementation of such CO2 EOR project is considered in a couple of countries as a mean to kickstart a broader implementation of CCS in their national energy and climate policies. But in other countries, as in Denmark, we have seen that there is a ban to do this technology because the whole fossil energy production is foreseen to sort it out. So we have also learned that the CO2 utilization projects gather in some countries a better public acceptance and are more favorable to start with the technology of bringing the CO2 in the decarbonization cycles. So some of the European countries have a focus on advancing this part of the CCUS value chain instead of permanent storage. But here we should point out that the potential for CO2 emission reduction of any type of CCU is strongly dependent on the permanence of the CO2 fixation in a new and final product. There should be also paid attention on the scale of applicability so that reasonable amounts of CO2 could be saved for a longer time, and that the overall lifetime of the carbon footprint of the CCU technology is fair, so the investment in a fair calculation way. So altogether, we can see that we have different projects as different pieces, and we need to repuzzle them in our energy system, and that all of them can contribute to reduce Europe's CO2 emission. So this is what I want to present here. For more information, I want to draw your attention on the chapter 5 of our report, and also on the annex where the special information about the individual countries are given. And then I want to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Connie. Excellent presentation on a very interesting topic in terms of, where are we really getting CO2 stored in the ground? I thought I would just mention that I did look up the CO2 price this morning, and it said it was 88 euros a tonne. So it has, the landscape has definitely changed since the darker years of CCS, where we did not have a good CO2 price. So I would like to hand over to our final presenter today. So Jan, I hope you are ready to present. I see that you are here under a pseudonym, so it's good to see you. And I will hand over to you to talk about CO2 storage research activities. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Carrie. I'll share my screen.
Okay, we see your screen, but we see your full screen.
Okay. This look all right?
Yep, that's good. It's in presentation mode now.
Okay. Right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I will present some results from the chapter 6 of the report on CO2 storage research activities on a national, regional, and European level. I'll present the research institutions, the FP7 and Horizon 2020 projects for the period of 2013 to 2020. I go through some other multinational and regional projects that are ongoing, how these institutions engage in a Europe-wide context. We'll have a quick look at the national CCS-related research efforts, and finally a word on the global engagement by European institutions with the rest of the world. So, if you start out with the research institutions, were reported 152 research institutions involved in CO2 storage-related research in 32 European countries, as you see from the map up to the left. The number of these institutions in the different countries varies a lot, but there is a clear correlation between the high number of research institutions involved and the availability of dedicated national funding instruments for CCS. In some cases, the number of institutions doesn't really reflect the activity of the different countries, because although there might be a lower number of institutions, some countries have centralized their CO2 research efforts. If you look at the FP7 and the Horizon 2020 projects for the period of 2013 to 2021, my apologies for this busy slide. On the right-hand side, you see a spreadsheet listing the European countries participating in the survey. For the gray countries, or in gray typeface, these did not submit a report to us, a filled-in questionnaire. So we have obtained information about some of the activities of these countries directly from the web. The list shows projects that are funded through FP7 and Horizon 2020, active as of June 30th, 2021 to the left, and completed projects from the period 2013 to 2021 in the right, which were not included in the previous report from 2013. So the pattern you see here is showing the participation of different countries in different projects and programs, with the light green squares indicating participation. The dark green ones indicate the country is coordinating these projects. And as we see, there is a clear pattern here showing that most countries are or have been involved in projects funded through FP7 and Horizon 2020 at some point during this period, although the coordination efforts seem to be focused on a relatively limited number of countries and institutions. Project funding has increased significantly, so the total budget of listed projects amounts to 316 million euros, of which 70% is covered through the FP7 and Horizon 2020. And the budget of the projects active as of June 2021 amounted to 213 million euros. So what we see is that the project scale has increased quite significantly, with an average number for the projects active as of June 2021 of 11.2 million euros, and the average budget for projects completed between 2013 and June 2021 at 7.8 million euros. So on average, there are 3 to 5 CO2 storage related projects that have been initiated annually for the last 5 years. And as we see from the diagram on the bottom left, there has been a substantial increase in the annual budget of CO2 related projects, which are wholly or partly funded through FP7 and Horizon 2020. So there's a major pickup in activity. The small dip you see in 2021 is due to the fact that this report has a deadline of June 2021. So for the last half of 2021, we don't have the numbers, but there is a steady increase in the funding here. With respect to other multinational and regional CO2 storage research projects for the same period, we'll go through the different initiatives that are ongoing at the moment. So ERA, which is the European Energy Research Alliance, is the research pillar of the European Strategy Energy Plan, the SET. It has the task of aligning the R&D activities of individual research organizations with the SET plan priorities, and has a joint program on CCS with sub-programs on CO2 capture, transport, and storage. The storage program is organized into monitoring, static modeling, and dynamic modeling. It has a close cooperation with the European CCS research infrastructure, EXCEL, and the European Zero Emission Technology and Innovation Platform, ZEP. ERA supports Horizon 2020 CCS projects and also participates actively in building collaborations outside of Europe. ACT was initially an AeroNet co-fund through the Horizon 2020 and then entirely funded by the participating countries. So key topics that ACT addresses are monitoring, storage capacity assessment, land planning, and infrastructure. So 11 storage related projects were funded between 2017 and 2020, as you can see on the map to the right, with the numbers indicating the number of projects in which the different countries participated. In addition to that, there were 4 storage-related projects that are funded from the 2020 call. These were recently announced. These are Cementegrity, Ensure, Return, and Sharp projects. These are not included in the budgetary numbers that were shown on the previous slide. RFCS, the Research Council for Coal and Steel, supports research and innovation within coal and steel industry. It aligns with the European Green Deal, supporting the zero carbon steel production by 2030, and funds a number of CCS-related projects. As examples, there is Coal by Pro, which is handling of CO2 emissions from industry, ROCS, which is research on coal seams for CO2 storage, and Low Carbon Future, which looks at the low carbon future steel industry. Then there is the Regional Baltic CCUS Network, or BaseRec CCS, which is an association of experts and stakeholders in the countries indicated on the map. They host annual Baltic Carbon Forum. Among the projects are included the Route CCS, which is routing deployment of carbon capture, use, and storage in the Baltic region. And they are currently developing a CO2 geological storage project plan for the Baltic Sea region. Then there is the Norwegian CCS Center, which is an international research cooperation on CO2 capture, transport, and storage, and stands behind the CO2 storage in the North Sea and realization of the full chain CCS project by 2022, Longship or Northern Lights. And a precursor to that was the Nordic CCS project from 2011 to 2015, which was already referred to by VIT, where the aim was to establish a virtual CCS networking platform aiming to increase CCS deployment in the Nordic countries through close collaboration between research institutions and industry. So one of the products coming out of that was the Storage Atlas, and looking at regional CCS scenarios with respect to centralized storage. And this is effort is coming now into fruition through the NCCS project. Then there is GeoERA, establishing the European Geological Service Research Area. This is a co-fund action run by the National and Regional Geological Survey Organizations of Europe, or GSOs. There are 32 member countries and received funding through the Horizon 2020 program for the period of 2018 to 2022. The intention here is to integrate the GSO information on subsurface energy, water, and raw material resources. GeoEra organizes and co-funds transnational research projects. And although you might say that GeoEra does not directly address CO2 storage, we include it here as it has a relevance to geological storage and transnational cooperation, as was also evident from the spreadsheet I showed early on, where the GeoEra forms a kind of common platform where most European countries are involved. If we step into the Europe-wide engagement, it can be quantified in several ways. In the report, we have chosen to employ a proxy metric for the engagement of individual countries with other European countries in CCS research. So we have calculated a number by summing the number of other participating countries in all projects where a country participates, and end up with a index number, which essentially shows the contact point to different countries for the countries shown in the map on the right. And as you see, there is quite a spread in these contacts. For the category from 1 to 33, the common contact point is exactly the GeoEra initiative, where participating countries are connected with 31 other countries on a European level. I should also emphasize that the country participation here, with the numbers shown, also includes both industry and research institutions. With respect to the national CCS-related research, it's difficult to assess and compare the national efforts in detail. The level of detail provided by the questionnaires about national policies varies substantially and also varies quite a lot in detail. So it's more a kind of a not only a helicopter view, but a satellite image view that can be presented based on that. From the questionnaires, we have 18 countries reporting a total of more than 90 CO2 storage-related projects that were nationally funded. And these range from developing test sites to PhD projects. So there's a big spread both in the number and scales on these projects. If you look at it a bit more in detail, the national funded projects appear to be focused on storage capacity assessments, which were reported by 16 of 18 countries, modeling of subsurface storage process, which was reported by 14 of 18 countries, well technologies, 8 of 18, social acceptance, also 8 of 18, and complex management, 9 of 18 countries reported that. 13 countries reported that they host large-scale CCS facilities, ranging from specialized laboratories to complete test sites. This also includes the 80 facilities tied to the European research infrastructure for CO2 capture, utilization, transport, and storage, EXCEL, as you can see from the map down to the right. With respect to global engagement, there are a number of countries that are involved in Horizon 2020 projects that are outside of Europe. This includes Australia, Canada, China, Japan, the United Arab Emirates, and the USA. And as you see, these countries are involved both in the Horizon 2020 projects, the regional networks like the NCCS, ACT projects, both in the 2019 grant and the 2017 grant. And as we see, there are some countries that are quite active within some of these programs. There's also the Mission Innovation, which is the global intergovernmental platform comprising 22 countries and the European Commission for Action-Oriented Cooperation, which was followed up by Mission Innovation 2, launched in 2021. The mission here is to catalyze action and investment in research, development, and demonstration to make clean energy affordable, attractive, and accessible for all this decade. So quite an ambition there, but it looks like the international engagement with respect to CCS is picking up quite significantly. So to conclude, the European CCS research appears to be shaped by the sum of national efforts. This is both with respect to national legislation, for instance, the legal constraints to storage nationally, The national regional storage opportunities, also in terms of say, regional and national geology, access to funding, both through EU regional networks and availability of dedicated national funds, the availability of national research infrastructure, institutional collaborative networks, both national and international, and finally also industry involvement with the emission-intensive industries and also the petroleum industries. So where these are present, we often see quite an engagement of these industries in ongoing research. Finally, the FP7 and Horizon 2020 numbers for, unfortunately, the only place where we have specific numbers about the funding show a substantial increase in the spending on CCS research since 2013. Since these programs cover up to 70% of the cost of the projects, and a corresponding increase in the industry funding of these projects can also be said to have happened. So funding for CCS related projects is picking up quite significantly, both from a centralized level from the funding agencies like FP7 and Horizon 2020, but also from the industry side. Finally, there also appears to be an increasing international outreach. Although we haven't focused too much on this subject, it might be something that probably will have a larger place in the follow-up report of this report, which is probably due in a few years' time. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jan, and I hope that you're volunteering to take part in the next version of the report.
Hey, me, I'm in.
Excellent. So we've had some good questions and points raised in the chat. So focusing first on utilization. So we've had a comment that we should also have in mind to replace energy and CO2 intensive materials like steel or cement with more sustainable materials such as carbon fibers. And we've had a question. Connie already mentioned something on utilization and one of the previous projects. But the question is, anyone who has seen any of the CO2 reuse projects not increasing emissions? And a follow-up, for countries that do not permit CCS, do you think they will close down their cement industry? So I think these are two very thought-provoking questions, and I'd like to open this to the speakers to see if anybody would like to respond to these. Connie, I see you are unmuted.
Yeah, I can start, but I have no final answer to this question. I cannot imagine that they close down a certain industry, but it's also now at the moment beyond my imagination in what kind of compensation schematics they calculate for their emissions or how they compensate remaining emissions. What I imagine is that the carbon cycles where decarbonization measures are combined to make it more and more efficient, that this could be a way out. But nevertheless, I have here also doubts that the life cycle assessment must be fair to calculate what the remaining emissions are at the end. So maybe the market will regulate this, and this is hard to say now at the moment where different cement industries are competing with different measures of emission reduction. Maybe some other can comment on this in addition. Thanks.
Thanks, Connie. Would any of the other speakers like to attempt this bit? I see you're unmuted.
Well, if I may very briefly comment on that, in my understanding, the decarbonization plans should bring some clarity on this, because at the moment, I think that only very few countries really made thorough decarbonization plans to achieve net zero in 2050. And if you don't go into the very detail, so you don't see the necessity to to really decarbonize every part of the economy. And in my personal understanding, those countries who did this exercise, most of them found out that it's impossible without some kind of CCS, either on industrial emissions or the negative emissions or both. But unless you really dig into these details in your national decarbonization plans or industrial sector decarbonization plans, you will not find out this necessity. And I'm afraid that this is the case of many countries in Europe. There is some framework for net zero in 2050, but not really worked out into these latest details.
I think that's a very good question. It was raised at one of the COP26 events where Co2GeoNet was hosting as well, to ask about how we tackle emissions and have countries actually planned out in detail how they will meet their zero emission targets. I think it's a very good question to ask. And I have to say, I think that CCS is recognisable as really the available technology that's ready now to tackle the cement emissions. So there are more efficiencies to be found in cement manufacture, as you can see from recent reports, but it still remains a question, what can we do now to tackle the emissions that we have now? And so I think urgency remains a very key message for tackling climate change. So do any of the other speakers want to tackle these questions before we move on to the next? Okay, so we haven't, Jan, do I see you?
Just a very short comment, essentially. I mean, what you see drives research and innovation is often necessity. And it appears that a number of industrial companies that are high emission are currently feeling the pressure to do something, because the cost of emission is pretty high. And in the long term, they will find it you can't have a profitable business out of it. So alternatives will force themselves forward based on that necessity. I think it's quite positive to see also that there's a there's an increasing number of industry companies that get involved in this kind of CCS research. Simply because they feel there is a necessity to do something in order to stay in business. So I think this is partly market regulated, what we are seeing. So I think it's a positive sign.
I agree with you. I saw that some of UK lawyers had started to present fact sheets on CCS. So I assume that they are looking for business. So I think you're right, the market is starting to drive this forward. So the last question we have time for today is asking about storing CO2 in basalts. So the comment is that the Carbfix has great scientific value and a very important driver to further boost CCS implementation. But what about when we move to industrial scale? So for example, how much basalt is available? What about the pressure evolution of the storage site or injectivity and the water volumes required? So would any of our speakers like to comment on industrial scale storage in basalts? Can it be expanded?
If I may try to respond to that, I'm not an expert in mineral storage, of course, and I don't know if there is anybody in the audience from Carbfix or the consortia around this project, so maybe there are much better experts than me. But from what I know, the colleagues in Iceland are doing a lot of research and other work on this upscaling to megaton and gigaton scale. And if you follow the literature and presentation by them, they are dealing with that. And from what they are presenting, it looks like very promising, at least at the sites in Iceland. And according to this recent findings, as they presented, the upscale to the megaton storage is possible, looking at all the geochemical and physical and hydraulical conditions. But definitely there should be someone who is deeply involved in this technology to answer this question in detail.
I can comment also a few sentences. What I wish is that we see it in a very pragmatic way. There are really good locations where the technology works without any additional efforts. So what is addressed here? The water volume is a point. So you should be close to the sea or to a water source. So as far as I know, they are trying also to use seawater, which should be also successful, doable. And then, yes, of course, all the other issues as the energy consumption and so on. And yeah, the principal location to the facility which is producing the emission, this should be considered. So what I saw, it is at the moment kind of hype because it runs so good and because it has its own branding. So it's the Icelandic branding, but I think we cannot exercise it everywhere. So there should be a good pragmatism where it is really an efficient solution at which location. So this is my impression on this. The rest I agree with completely. Thanks.
I agree with you, Connie. CCS will look different everywhere, and that's okay. That's as it should be. We have to find the most effective options. It's worth noticing that in India, for example, they have huge basalt Deccan traps. So there are lots and lots of areas that are being considered, and I believe there is a basalt storage atlas which we could dig out if people are interested. I believe it's even referenced in the report as an option. So if you want to dig around in the report, it's in there. And one person has sneaked a little question under the radar. So they wanted to ask about environmental monitoring for CO2 storage projects. So they were thinking of sort of monitoring the shallow subsurface and biota. So for any of the active projects, could you comment? I think I am responsible for a small testbed in the UK, and there we are monitoring the shallow subsurface and the air immediately above. But it is a very small test site where we will inject a few tons of CO2, and we are actually trying to leak a small amount of CO2 to the atmosphere because we want to test out our monitoring tools. We want to show how small amount of CO2 we can find. But I'm sure for some of the other projects that there could also be comments on the environmental monitoring undertaken. So would any of the speakers like to comment?
I would just maybe state that this was not really a target of our report, that we didn't examine the monitoring part of the individual projects, but indeed there are monitoring plans and monitoring activities in any of the projects, because it's an inherent part, and even the EU legislation requires that every storage site is monitored. So that they can be really approved. So, but there is a lot of research and even already practical experience with monitoring, including also the running industrial sites like Sleipner. So I think those of our colleagues who are interested, they can find a lot of information about this in the literature already published.
I agree, and I think one of the projects that I could mention is the Enos project, which was an initiative of Co2GeoNet, and this researched advancing onshore CO2 storage, and there is also a great interest in protecting groundwater and the environment at CO2 storage sites, so that may also be of interest to that question. So I think that's all the questions that we have time for at the moment, and I would like to thank all of our speakers again and all of the authors of the report, because the report is a huge piece of work, and thank you very much to the authors. And I would like to thank everybody for joining us today for our webinar, and we hope to see you soon. So thank you very much, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you.
Bye-bye.